Latitude Media, covering the new frontiers of the energy transition.
I'm Shayle and this is Catalyst.
For the first time, maybe our industry can really focus on affordability being the be-all and end-all in DERs and not resilience. Because I think over the last decade, it's been a lot of resilience because it's a premium product, but permissionless speaks to, no, these are super cheap, they're easy, and it's all about cost savings.
Coming up, it's plug and play, or plug and store, I guess.
What if utilities could meet surging electricity demand with energy assets already in homes and businesses? Uplight is making this possible by turning customers and their smart energy devices into predictable grid capacity through an integrated demand stack. Uplight's AI-driven platform activates smart thermostats, batteries, EVs, and customers to generate, shift, and save energy when the grid needs it most. Learn how Uplight is helping utilities unlock flexible load at scale, reduce costs, and accelerate decarbonization at uplight.com.
Catalyst is brought to you by Antenna Group, the communications and marketing partner for mission-driven organizations developing and adopting climate, energy, and infrastructure solutions. Their team of experts helps businesses like yours identify, refine, and amplify your authentic climate story. With over 3 decades of experience as a growth partner to the most consequential brands in the industry, their team is ready to make an impact on day one. Get started today at antennagroup.com.
I'm Shayle. I lead the early stage venture strategy at Energy Impact Partners. Welcome. So distributed batteries are starting to have a moment. There are lots of examples of this. The biggest recently probably being Base Power. You may remember I had Zach Dell, the founder of Base, on the pod a few months ago, just right in the wake of their $1 billion fundraise to go deploy residential batteries throughout the country. If you're talking residential batteries, Base is kind of at one end of a spectrum. Their whole play is oversizing the battery to use it for market participation. But there's another end to the spectrum, which falls into the category of so-called permissionless DERs or plug-in. It's a broader category that includes things like balcony solar, which is really popular in Germany. But I would say the main thrust of the category, at least in the US, are very small batteries that you can usually plug into a standard 120-volt outlet. And you can use them to provide backup for a large appliance, but also maybe to reduce peak charges on the bill, maybe to participate in demand response programs, maybe even to aggregate enough to become a virtual power plant. By the way, they're not just for residential consumers. As you'll soon hear, small businesses also can take advantage of them. It's an interesting area with a somewhat unsettled policy and regulatory landscape. But there are some things about it that are extraordinarily attractive, largely the potential for speed and low-cost installation. I've been spending some time trying to make sense of this category, and the person who really understands it best, I think, is the one who's actually deploying these systems, and that is James McGinniss, who's our guest today. James is the founder and CEO of David Energy. They are deploying these plug-in systems today. You'll hear a little bit about doing it at small businesses in New York, and they believe there's a real business there. So let's hear why. Here's James. James, welcome.
Thanks, Shayle. Thanks for having me. I'm super, super pumped to be here.
Excited to finally have you on and to talk about permissionless DERs. Start by telling me what are permissionless DERs?
It's funny because I think Duncan coined the term permissionless on our podcast a couple of years ago, and I've actually started using a different term. But
strategically, probably smart to change the name.
Yeah, but I think permissionless is for the wonks, and what I've been using as plug-in is for customers and for sort of consumers. It's more intuitive. But I do think there's also an important distinction between what those two terms mean. So permissionless, to me, is a very broad category of technologies across segments and verticals and customer sizes. That really refers to not needing interconnection agreements. Mm-hmm. Although I admit that when we came up with it, it was sort of just even something that required less of an interconnection was part of the concept. So really anything that helps you get interconnected to the grid faster and puts less burden on the interconnection process falls into this bucket of permissionless of things that I'm personally excited about. So I think some particular examples of that was it's everything from like Impulse Labs having a battery in a cooktop that's plug-in to at the time we were thinking a lot about Electric Era doing battery-enabled DC fast charging where you wouldn't need an interconnection upgrade. You may still even need like a permit or permits in that case to CNI off-grid where you may still need permits of some sort, but you don't need an interconnection. Like I think there's companies like Critical Loop out there like now doing stuff like this. Then that's not to mention there's plenty of permits that aren't even interconnection related that you do actually need to be thinking about rules and regs. And so I think permissionless, though, in the end of the day, speaks to the concept of being able to do things without heavy red tape or regulation, and particularly when it comes to interconnection.
You're not asking for it. You're not submitting an interconnection request, but there is an interconnect there still.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of one of the most powerful concepts in this whole thing, actually, is that the reason it can be cheaper and easier to do, and it's so exciting, is that the 120 volt or the 240 volt outlet is a pre-existing bidirectional interconnection point on the grid that you can actually push power into, and it's safe to do so at the circuit level. And so when you look at traditional installs, we're basically doing an open heart surgery on the panel. You have to, do all this work with an electrician to actually tap into the system, but there's already a point sitting there for you that interconnects into the home and the broader grid through that outlet.
I was trying to think what the extension of that analogy would be. If normal interconnection is open heart surgery on the panel, are you like you're like sticking a lollipop in your mouth or something like that?
Yeah, it's like, well, I haven't even thought of that actually. Yeah, but it's I don't know. You're just like putting on a t-shirt more like you're just like you're using
That's
you're just
yeah.
it's a function that you have available to you, So yeah.
Okay, so there's some stuff that's like not so relevant in the US currently, but like balcony solar, this thing that is pretty big in Germany, not so much here, could be considered into this category as well. But I think mostly, correct me if I'm wrong, like mostly what we want to talk about is batteries. And you mentioned a few different, I guess, form factors, right? Like there's the Electric Era battery integrated into an EV charger, or there's the battery that's displacing a interconnection for a load or something like that. But I mean, the category that I know you're spending a lot of time in that I find interesting and want to understand better is the just take a battery and plug it in behind the meter, maybe connected to an appliance inside a load, inside a home or a business or whatever it might be, like a very small home battery. And so in that category, there are products available today, right? Like anybody can go buy a bunch of different batteries. So it seems to have emerged as a category. I don't know, it's been around because stuff like EcoFlow, I think, has been around for a while, but like there's a little bit of a mini explosion here, right?
100%. And yeah, I think, us wonks love our ever multiplying acronyms and definitions and stuff. I think of what you just described as plug-in, because specifically it's just very intuitive. You think about plugging a DER or something with a battery or solar. I actually think balcony solar is part of this and is very relevant in the US today. That is plug-in solar or plug-in batteries. I just think that makes a lot more sense intuitively, and that it's a subcategory of a broader permissionless space that when we think of permissionless, we think of really big stuff too. That's how I think about it. But yeah, so for today, like I actually think plug-in is the right idea to think about.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about plug-in. But before we get off of the idea of permissionless, the question of permission and of interconnection is actually like a core question as to the value proposition of plug-in. So what is the state of affairs? If I want to plug one of these little batteries in my house, maybe I'm using it as backup for my fridge or whatever it might be. What is the lay of the land in terms of what requirements it needs to meet, what permissions I do need? Is it murky? Is it defined? Like, where are we there?
It is murky. I think what really matters is the thing we focus on a lot is safety. So there are plenty of UL certified products that adhere to the NEC, saying you can plug this in the following manner and it's safe to do so. And so there may be jurisdictional like AHAs or DOBs or fire departments that have an opinion on what should go in a given location, how big of a battery or something like that. But at the sort of electrical code level, this is already allowed under the current guidance. And there are many products that support that. So from that lens, you could say in most places, you can go out and buy these things and plug them in whatever state you're in. A lot of the attention that's happened recently around regulations is specifically there's bills now introduced in, I think it's up to 24 states with maybe 30 soon, introducing bills where you can actually export to the grid through these devices. And so we think of that as an extremely important distinction where a lot of that regulation that's being passed is focused on really what is an interconnection agreement? What permission do I need from there for the utility? Whereas I understand the utility's concern is, hey, if you just start exporting and the grid goes down and our line workers out there, they don't actually know a line is energized and we don't like people just exporting without us knowing what's going on or how much power that may be. And so a lot of these rules that are being introduced and passed are focusing on anything up to typically 1.2 kilowatts is you can export that amount from a meter, from a home. And it's really even narrowly focused on consumer applications. That actually does tie back to the NEC in some ways because it gets into, okay, if we're going to make these commercially available and you're allowed to export them, how big of a system do we want to be creating and allowed under or being UL certified? Because it gets into what actually at the circuit level, like a 20 amp circuit, what can that handle? And so there's actually somewhat of an alignment between those two concepts happening, but we view them as actually very clearly distinct. You could be have 20 kilowatts of behind the meter capacity and your peak load is 50 kilowatts and you're never exporting. And then that's an interesting question. Do you need an interconnection agreement for that? It's all happening via the plug with UL certified products that the NEC stands on how you're deploying it based on like panel and circuit sizing and stuff. So I just think about it that like when people say backfeeding, they typically mean into the grid. But I think under current NEC and UL, you could actually go buy some of these systems today and use them at home. And that's an interesting sort of debate going on right now because some utility people even say, even if it's not exporting, there should be a permit and or permission. And that is still, you are still interconnecting into the system by doing that.
Right. Okay. So it is murky, as you said, but seems like in some cases there's stuff you can do now. In other cases, there's stuff that might be coming that you can do, like exporting to the grid under certain conditions if some of these bills pass. Let's talk about why, like what's interesting about this. How much of the value proposition for putting a battery in a home or a business that's, very small, if it's sub 1.2 kilowatts, is the value proposition resiliency? Like, are you plugging it into a load and saying this is backup for this particular appliance? Or are you thinking of it as like this is savings on your electric bill, or is it some combination of the two?
I think what's really excited about permissionless and plug-in is that it is about affordability. That's what we saw, sort of why it got adopted so quickly in Germany. It's not about resilience. That said, I do think in these early applications, and this actually gets back to what's allowed, what certainly does seem to be allowed no matter what is if you just plug a battery into a wall and then a device into that battery, you're not pushing power back into the circuit at all. You're just removing loads from the grid. That doesn't seem to need an interconnection agreement or is allowed, as long as that product is certified. So I do think a big focus right now is on the appliance level. And given that, there's a resilience angle to it. So some of the companies out there are talking about resilience and self-reliance, and that's important. You can put a battery connected to your fridge at home and it'll back that up. However, I think the big story and the really exciting one is what this really does to what we think about install and the cost and accessibility of these systems. It's going to drive them much, much lower than we've seen in the past. And that means that for the first time, maybe our industry can really focus on affordability being the be-all and end-all in DERs and not resilience. Because I think over the last decade, it's been a lot of resilience because it's a premium product, but permissionless speaks to, no, these are super cheap, they're easy, and it's all about cost savings.
And they're super cheap and easy because, in part, there's no design, there's no engineer, there's no electrician, and so presumably you can get, but it is smaller, so you get less economies of scale. Like, how much cheaper do you think it can be relative to a Powerwall or something like that, like a larger home battery?
Yeah. So, I mean, an easy rule of thumb is that soft costs are typically 50% or more of a residential install. Permissionless can effectively put that to zero, because three of the big components are permitting, labor, and CAC. And so think about a buy online motion where a consumer is just going to Amazon and buying one of these and plugging them in themselves. That totally removes CAC and soft costs. And then also, based on all the regulation that's being worked on now, is the permitting side of things, can go away as well. So half of the cost in a residential install you could think of as basically being gone. So obviously they're smaller systems. You could say maybe there's marginally more expensive, just the size of the unit. Maybe there's some efficiencies, say in like a Powerwall or how you set up the inverter there versus like an all-in-one system. But I think what matters there is that's a marginal difference. And the real plummeting costs are still in the hardware side of things. So solar and storage continue to get cheaper. If that were to continue to be the case, these soft costs aren't going anywhere in traditional installs. And so if you're going to remove that, it basically means that in permissionless, your floor is like all the way down to just the hardware costs. And I find that incredibly exciting.
The grid is changing fast. Data centers, electrification, and extreme weather are driving a surge in energy demand. Utilities can meet the moment with existing resources by activating energy customers and their distributed energy resources to create predictable and flexible capacity with Uplight's integrated demand stack. Uplight coordinates energy efficiency, rates, demand response, and virtual power plant programs into one cohesive strategy to strengthen grid resilience, improve energy affordability, and make progress toward clean energy goals. Learn how Uplight is helping leading utilities harness over 8 gigawatts of flexible load at uplight.com.
Catalyst is brought to you by Antenna Group, the OGs of PR and marketing for climate tech. Is your brand a leader or challenger? Are you looking to win the hearts and minds of customers, partners, or investors? Are you ramping up your new biz pipeline? Are you looking to influence policy conversations? Antenna works with leading brands across the energy, climate, and infrastructure space to do all of this and more. If you're a startup, investor, enterprise, or innovation ecosystem that's helping drive climate's age of adoption, Antenna Group is ready to power your impact. Visit antennagroup.com to learn more.
Yeah, it is super interesting. The limitation is scale. Unless the regulations turn out to be you can do as much of it as you want to do, let's just say you're capped at 1.2 kilowatts per house, there's only so much saving. So okay, the point that you're making, maybe just stepping back for a second, is that, and I think people don't always appreciate this, folks who are buying home batteries now, right? They're generally doing it for one of two reasons. One reason is if they're in like California and you have a net meter, if you have solar and you have net metering rules that make it like super uneconomic to have solar unless you can discharge it into the house or discharge it into the grid at different times of day when solar is not generating. And so it's economically beneficial to you to have storage in addition to solar. But the other reason outside of that specific context, say you don't have solar, you're not in a California type net metering thing, it's basically entirely a resiliency value proposition, because the economics, if you're just trying to save money on your bill of having a battery, aren't at a residential scale, are not that great yet. You don't save that much on a demand charge, right? But is that true with the permissionless ones? Because yes, you get a cheaper battery, but you can only shave a tiny bit of the peak because the battery is small, right?
Well, what's interesting though is that this gets into the market opportunities that it's opening up. and small is relative to the load you're placing on when you say it like that. 1.2 kilowatts and a kilowatt battery may be a decent amount of the load if you're a single bedroom apartment renter. Like this is the balcony solar stuff, right?
Right.
And for them, it's extremely economical, and really that's just opening up a TAM that no one's really. I know people do multifamily installs, but like the idea of just a tenant buying one of these and having access now is totally like, I think just like radically new, and people are still underappreciating this point. And this is where looking to Germany is very interesting, because this was, COVID, Ukraine war stuff going on. Energy prices were going through the roof in Germany, which led to a lot of the acceleration in these systems, because people were putting their hands up and saying, I'm paying 40, 50 cents a kilowatt hour. I'm just going to go buy my own solar, plug it in. And all that's doing is offsetting the 40 cents they would have had to pay, right? And so you don't even need complicated, VDER or even net metering. Like a lot of this, again, people are thinking about this from an exporting to the grid, but there's a lot of damage these things can do to your bill in a good way behind the meter that you don't even need to be compensated that much for the exports. And that's the action that we saw in Germany. And really remarkable there is in the last 4 years or so, they've seen 4 million of these systems adopted. So 4 million in homes or apartments or however you think about it, whereas that's about the same size as the traditional single family installs, which did see a lot of growth in the last year, but those have been around for decades, right? And so I think that comparison is really remarkable, but just the idea that in a handful of years, people just started buying these systems, and it's over a gigawatt now in basically installed capacity, and deploying that in 4 years through these systems is remarkable. So,
but I want to make sure that we're clear on that. That's basically that's the balcony solar stuff, right? That's solar, not storage.
That's balcony solar. Some of those are starting to come with storage, right?
Right. Whereas what we're talking about here, you made the point, maybe it does include the balcony solar concept as well, but I think just as often, it's just the battery here.
Right. And so, yeah, that does get to your point on demand charges or demand response programs. But to that end, some of the work we've seen in New York City, it's about $50 per month per kilowatt shaved, which to a small business actually can mean a lot, especially if they own 10 locations or so. And if you're doing a couple kilowatts, then that can be pretty meaningful. Or you look at some other work, like Standard Potential has done this with HVAC units in apartments, just sort of disintermediating the window unit, that you can enroll those in demand response programs even without demand charge management. And so we, in a commercial application, are stacking the full value that everyone usually thinks of like delivery charges, demand response, energy values, et cetera. But in commercial, you're exposed to demand charges, for example, whereas you're not in an apartment, basically.
Are these typically multi-hour duration systems? Are they like 1 hour? Like, does it matter? If it's 1.2 kilowatts, how many kilowatt hours is it?
They're often sized like basically 1-to-1, but that doesn't mean you're using the full 1.2 kilowatt, especially if you're plugging into an appliance. Like the appliance may be 400 watts or something. So that's basically a 3-hour battery. But the other thing I'd say is like in Texas, for example, demand charges are volumetric. And a lot of people add batteries to their solar systems in the traditional way to avoid consumption because they're getting billed for delivery. And so if you do have solar and storage together, you can avoid delivery charges. Storage alone isn't going to do that, but there are things you can get out of storage alone, even in residential and even more so in commercial.
I'm just doing rough unit economic math in my head on the New York example that you gave, and it actually sounds really good, right? Because you're saying $50 a month in savings, so that's $600 a year in savings to the customer. And these are, let's say it's a 1 kilowatt hour system, install cost of a residential battery, normal, typical residential battery might be, $800 a kilowatt hour or something like that today. People think they can get it down below that, but say it was half that, that'd be $400 a kilowatt hour. So you're paying $400 for the thing, pays itself back in less than a year.
That's
basically
right.
On just that rough math. That's actually pretty compelling.
And what we've seen is in the commercial application, installed costs of like less than 10% of system costs. And it's closer to zero because all those soft costs are gone. But yeah, so I think whether it's a battery, it's solar plus storage, it's solar alone in these plug-in applications, that it is about affordability. And if we can learn from Germany, the more that we see bills go up in the US, regardless of what the rules out there are, people are going to go on Amazon, they're going to start buying the stuff, they're going to start plugging it in. And so I think this is coming one way or another. And it's really exciting because it is like a bottoms up, economically driven motion that I think we'll see.
How do you solve for CAC? Because it strikes me that, as you said, one of the big components of the cost of a traditional system is customer acquisition cost. You don't get to spread that customer acquisition cost across as large a system. So the only way it feels to me to make this work is if customer acquisition cost is effectively zero. So like if there's yes, the customer proactively goes online and buys the thing sales motion, then that does mean customer acquisition cost is effectively zero, but you are offering a somewhat complicated value proposition with energy bill savings and all that kind of stuff. So like, how do you sell this without blowing out the costs because of that soft cost?
Right. Well, that's definitely right. Obviously there's an online, digital channel CAC and stuff like that. I do think it's very different for, say, a third party wanting to offer this to customers and use it as a VPP or stuff like that versus, say, an OEM that's just like listing it on a website that is maybe much more actively bought by the consumer. So I think more about the latter case where, yeah, if someone's just going and buying, it's just, think about that compared to door knocking, right? Which is still like it's exponentially cheaper. And so if not zero, I still think it's going to be, a very small part of the overall costs for the customer.
You mentioned demand response participation. That one's interesting because I think generally for demand response programs, correct me if I'm wrong, you need like minimum scale to participate. And so like can a 1 kilowatt load reduction participate on its own in a demand response program? Is that an economic thing to do? Or do you need to amass a sufficient density and capacity to be able to then bid into the program?
It can be both, where like an aggregator needs this minimum threshold, say of like 100 kilowatts, but then at the device level, like per meter enrolled, it's a minimum of 100 watts or 10 watts or something like that. It's different based on every jurisdiction. Like what I just mentioned is more, I think how Con Ed thinks about it. In NYSO, there may be like a 10 kilowatt per meter per device rule. Other places like Massachusetts will have it by actually just the device itself you enroll directly. It's not even done through the meter. And so they all differ, but from a technical lens, you can go as small as you want, right? It's not hard to validate that these things are actually doing what we think they're doing. So really, any blocker there would just be sort of how the rules and regs are set up for a given program, and all of those vary. But what we've seen is like there's plenty where, yes, things this small can participate in this stuff.
I know you're doing this at businesses too, right? So it's not just a consumer thing, and you made the point of like $50 a month savings at a business is relevant. So this is sort of small commercial also is relevant here as well. At the micro level, at the macro level, the question is, because these things are small, can you get enough of them deployed that it starts to matter? Can we get to hundreds of megawatts, gigawatts of this stuff? And like, what does that have to look like?
Yes, 100%. And yeah, I heard you, is the time now for DER's episode with Andy, I think recently I listened to. And you made this great point where you're like, it's all about removing friction, basically, right? And if you think about affordability and scale, it ties back to friction. How much friction is there in the buying motion, the deployment, the installs, et cetera? And again, if you look to Germany, like doing a gigawatt in a handful of years in what is a much smaller, country than ours, it wouldn't shock me to see tens of gigawatts deployed in the next 5 to 10 years in the US, where that's actually making a meaningful dent, not just in the whole DER space, but in the sort of gap, the capacity shortfall that we're seeing with load growth in the U.S. And so when I think of how these things act in the aggregate, I think in tens of gigawatts would not shock me in the near future.
Well, I mean, just as a thought exercise, it's like an interesting question, right? So everybody in DER world right now is like chasing this data center needs to come online. Utility needs more capacity in order to bring the data center online. Can you construct this kind of three-party deal wherein somebody deploys a bunch of DERs in one construct or another? There are various versions of this, and it counts as sufficient aggregated capacity to accelerate the interconnect, right? Like everybody's chasing some version of that thing. To do that here, right? Like the minimum scale from a data center perspective is probably 100 megawatts or something like that. So you would have to deploy that at 100,000 premises, right? To get enough capacity, or probably more, because you're not going to get full ELCC credit or whatever. So hundreds of thousands, which sounds crazy. But at the same time, I don't know, if you're in New York and you can do it in every unit in an apartment building or something like that, like it starts to add up. So it's interesting to think about.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that example is interesting. My hope would be also the data centers building a lot of on-site capacity as well. And it's not fully burdened by, say, residential systems. But yeah, you just think about a lot of the big grids out there. We're talking 30 to 70, 80, 90 gigawatt peaks, maybe more if you're in PJM. And, either way, you're getting into like double-digit percentages of capacity potential, from these resources off of what the current peaks that we're seeing. It's not like it's just to say it's not some afterthought where it's like 0.001% of the total peak load on that grid. I think we could see like 10% or more, which is wild to think about in these small systems. The other thing I would say is like in the commercial application, we see paths to do Powerwall size or multiple Powerwalls, right? And so when you just narrow this to apartments and these smaller residential applications, it's a little narrowing compared to what plugin can do in general. Like you could see 5, 10, 20 kW systems just deployed through outlets to some degree. And again, like a lot of that is based on regulations, et cetera. But I don't think the story of them is only like these hyper small in apartment applications.
From a product perspective, are these just like pretty commoditized? Like it's just a small battery. Is there much to it? Is there any magic? Are there improvements that could or should be made apart from just like driving down cell costs?
100%. I think we're just seeing the early beginnings of form factors. I think there's gonna be a lot of innovation in form factors around batteries. You can think of that as a battery in a cooktop, or you can think of that as the battery, how it actually is designed for a plug-in application, which is actually extremely nascent as well. Actually, a lot of the early plug-in stuff was using what is normally for like camping setups for a consumer application, because that was what was available as like a fully mobile plug-based battery. You look at some of the work happening now, it gets into like 120 volt outlets versus 240 volt. What is the right actual like shape of these? Are you trying to place them on a fridge? Are you hanging them on a wall? Are you tucking them in a corner? How big should that battery be for a home or a business? Also, just the idea of it being an infrastructure grade asset. So I think one of the interesting things, for example, Pila, which I'm sure you know about, is focused on is like, we're not going to build some camping battery that doesn't have the greatest API or reliability. Like we're going to build these things to be networked at scale where you may be running hundreds of megawatts or gigawatt size VPP with just all these little plug-in batteries everywhere. Right. And so pretty much aside from the camping battery stuff, a lot of the companies I've mentioned have all been started in the last 5 years. And so I think it's incredibly nascent from a product standpoint. And there's already some early interesting form factors being developed, but I think there's the list of things that could happen is endless. Like I think there's even a company doing like a battery and a heat pump or something
I've
out
seen
there.
that.
And
That's actually
so like
it's
I just
Carrier. I mean, it's the biggest like
that's right.
company.
That's right. Yeah, it is. Yeah. So yeah, I just think there's going to be a lot of innovation in form factors over time, and what we're seeing is already pretty interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's all the time we had now. It's super interesting to watch how this is going to play out. I think it's like an underappreciated category, at least in the US. You've made repeatedly the point that it is well appreciated in Germany. But appreciate your time. Thanks for helping me walk through it.
Thank you, Shayle.
James McGinniss is the founder and CEO of David Energy. This show is a production of Latitude Media. You can head over to latitudemedia.com for links to today's topics. Latitude is supported by Prelude Ventures. This episode was produced by Max Savage Levinson. Mixing and theme song by Sean Marquand. Stephen Lacey is our executive editor. I'm Shayle Khan, and this is Catalyst.